Welcome everybody joining us this afternoon. Your anchor is Olga Atamanova, working at the Media Ukraine Center. Today we have a second event devoted to the issue of the European parliamentary election. We'll be talking about the feasible policy shifts as regards Ukraine. We have been joined by Vsevolod Chentsov, representative of the mission of the Ukraine to the European Union. Welcome, sir. Thank you for having me. Mr. Chentsov, we know that since 6th to 9th of June, the European Parliament went through the election, including millions of voters. 27 EU member states participated. Eventually, this is a very important for the European Union as well as for Ukraine. Let us start by enumerating our expectations and the reality check. How do you assess the outcomes of this election? Indeed, on the eve of the election, there were a lot of alarmist forecasts to the effect that we will see the shift toward the right, and these forecasts have lived up to the reality only partially. The composition of the EU and the structure of the parliament has seen little changes. The victory has been secured as it was in the previous 9th convocation by the European People's Party. They have now 175 seats. And of course, we have seen changes. That is to say, not in a drastic way, but Social Democrats have lost tens of seats, and the positions of liberal forces have been weakened, as well as the Greens. On the other hand, we've seen gains by the ECR, European conservatives and reformists. And as I have mentioned, in spite of the fact that we haven't seen the tectonic shifts, of course, these alterations, although relative they are, they will have an impact on the composition when the leading bodies will be formed at the European Parliament, at the European Council, and when the structure of the EU general policies will be decided, including Ukrainian issue. But in general terms, the takeaway is how will it affect the support for Ukraine and our prospects of becoming EU member in the nearest future? The takeaway is clear. The majority that is likely to be formed in the European Union will be pro-European and pro-Ukrainian. I'm talking about the coalition of the People Party, Social Democrats, and the Liberals. The open question, though, is how the cooperation will look like between European People's Party, with the right not to be taken as far right at the ECR. The intrigue is still there, but our forecast is that these political forces will be interacting in a constructive way. The ECR is likely to play a leading role, including the Prime Minister of Italy. This is the composition as we see it today. We all understand that the rights have not achieved such a success as they hoped for, and what they counted on was the change in history. Now they're not Eurosceptics, they don't strive for the dissolution of the European Union, and one of their aspirations is to decrease the powers of the supranational level and giving it down to the national level. What kind of changes are we going to see here? To reiterate, one should proceed from what we have in reality. If we look at the manifestos and election rhetoric of such forces as Ms. Le Pen party or party of leaders in the Netherlands, the agenda of today doesn't see the situation when they will strive for exiting the EU. And this is an important issue. Everyone has understood now. And the Brexit experience has shown that this is a wrong way to follow because it'll only weaken the position of a specific country. That's why I don't see the future of such a rhetoric. As for the reforming of the EU and the reform of the system of decision-making, as of now, this is a question of, I wouldn't say a high priority on the agenda. The issue is being discussed in the context of broadening the EU membership to see if EU is enlarged by tens of new members, how functional it'll be if the system of decision-making has not been changed. Again, we are talking about the issue of veto and the qualified majority. But to reiterate, the discussion of the strengthening of the intergovernmental component, I don't see it really important for today's agenda. As for the cornerstone issues for the future and the next developments, what we see post-election, it is very unlikely that we'll see major changes. Perhaps we will see the introduction with some modification of the green path. A lot of attention will be paid to digitalization and digital transformation. And the new issue that has sprung up vis-à-vis the Russian invasion, of course, is the defense capability of the EU, the development of the defense industry. And in this case, Ukraine enjoys quite serious chances of becoming not only a stakeholder of the discussion and framing and forming of such politics, but it'll be able to engage its own industry and defense industry of Ukraine as part of the general defense industry of the EU. Mr. Chentsov, we understand now that this country is living through a life-changing stage of accession of EU. As the result of this European Parliament election, what are the major hindrances of our way to EU? The results and the outcomes of this election at the institutional level and the government level of the EU was that in order to define whether the composition of factions will be different, now the trends towards enlargement, including the Ukrainian access, we feel that in the context of the dynamic of the process here in Brussels, is that the institutions and the member states have responded positively. Ukraine is moving steadily towards opening negotiations on membership. As we have claimed before, we will do our utmost to ensure that the first intergovernmental conference takes place while Belgium presides in the EU. I don't want to speculate on the time frame, but answering your question, the situation is stable. We don't see any drastic unexpected eventualities. Thank you very much, sir. Colleagues, you have questions, you are welcome. Nadia Uchenko from Ukrinform. In Ukraine, the outcomes of the European Parliament election is widely discussed with the view of how the policy towards Ukraine will be changed. On your take, how can Ukraine change its politics given that a right ideology is gaining ground in Europe? Perhaps we should change our way of interaction. What do you think the next developments are likely to be? Ukraine, as any other country, should respond to the changes in tendencies within the EU countries. And currently, it is too premature to assess how the outcomes of the election will reflect on the situation within EU. For example, the snap election just announced in France, or the similar decisions that are likely to be taken in other countries. But it is without any doubt that we should try to build up a constructive and meaningful dialogue with such forces as factions and as ECR, for example. In other words, these are conservatives and the reformers, and many EU parliamentarians that were working in the previous convocation were very much backing in Ukraine. And I hope that this trend will stay in the future. But given that this political faction will play a more active role, it means that we should sustain and activate a new stage of dialogue. To reiterate, I wouldn't like for us to mingle these forces. Right forces and far-right forces are different things. Unfortunately, very many representatives of the latter, at least until now, very often supported the Russian narratives as for the war against Ukraine. Yes, we should talk to them. We should interact with them, trying to explicate and to explain to them what the situation is. Perhaps they will change their ways too. Why do I believe so? Statistically speaking, the Le Pen's party or parties in Italy, for example, the Russian narrative and Putin were enjoying quite a good support by the body politic. And if this political segment is taken into account, the situation is changing in their rhetoric, and we see that the European parliamentarians are changing. I believe that we stand chances to increase our influence in this political niche. Mr. Chentsov, Ukrainian experts very often mention that this election campaign has seen a lot of disinformation spread by the social media as regards certain events in the EU and the background of some potential European parliamentarians. Have you seen any unnatural surge in such disinformation campaign? Unfortunately, the Russian Federation continues and perseveres in what it has been doing for the last decade, in particular in the mounting of disinformation campaign and other campaigns in the EU and beyond. As for the European Parliament, in the pre-election campaign, then we have identified such a network that was called Voice of Europe, and its representatives were in active contact with the European parliamentarians, and their connections with the Russian government were exposed. As far as I know, the investigation in the European Parliament is still going on. What is important here is this: unlike the previous situations of similar nature, a lot of steps have been made to neutralize such influences, to expose people behind such campaigns, and sanction lists have seen the broadening of the persons who are engaged in such networking. What we have seen is that European institutions are more proactive. They have taken on board their expertise, including the experience provided by Ukraine, in order to protect their political system from the Russian influences. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. Dear colleagues, let me remind you, we've been talking to Vsevolod Chentsov, representative of the mission of Ukraine to the European Union. Thank you for being with us. Our team is continuing our function. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, glory to Ukraine.